Hi, I'm Spoot Magoot or Rachel, and thanks so much for stopping by and checking out this video. This is a part two of the Black Skin, White Masks series. Black Skin, White Masks was a book by Frantz Fanon in the year 1950, and I believe it has really important lessons that we can learn for today. So thanks so much for joining me today. I'm sort of coming to you as I am because I've recognized that creating this part two has been taking a really long time for me. And in light of what has happened, so March 17th and today is March 18th as I'm filming this, Israel has resumed bombing of Gaza. And I am just aware that like some of these lessons like need to be out there, you know, and I don't want to keep like waiting longer. So I'm taking kind of a different approach with this series. So I really like this quote here. Our history takes place in obscurity, and the sun I carry with me must lighten every corner. My new principles that I'm sort of operating on here is that done is better than perfect, especially in regards to these videos. That I am presenting these as an activist, not an academic. And what that means is prioritizing the use case of each of these chapters and what is useful about it, not just sharing for knowledge's sake, as I kind of was in the introduction. We need to be aware that as the Trump administration takes increasingly fascist stances and actions, that the past is repeating. So we are here learning from the past, but we also need to recognize that our past teachers and leaders were flawed as human beings, just as we are flawed. So in later chapters, we'll talk about misogyny and some other isms that are present in Black Skin, White Masks. But we can still glean lessons from imperfect leaders. And finally, I can't keep up with the speed of the situation of America's fall into fascism, but I can go slightly faster than my pace to meet the need. And so please be a little patient with me as, you know, things are a little bit hodgepodge and less than perfect. I also didn't discuss in the introduction a little bit more context around from where Frantz Fanon was writing from. He's writing from the 1950s in what was called the French Antilles or Antilles. And these were the collection of islands you see below here. He was especially focused on the islands of Guadeloupe and Martinique, which I've circled in orange down below. And then this next slide is my own like speaking and reading notes. So I will be using these. I apologize that they're not the standard shortened bullet point format. So in chapter 1, he provides arguments and examples from the French Antilles and says that he is using them as an example, but this same behavior can be found in any race subjected to colonization. And I think what is important to note here is that all peoples today who are not billionaires, who are not millionaires, who are working class and subject to wages are also colonized peoples. And so we can still learn lessons about the constructs of colonialism, regardless of race or privilege. However, we must be consistently and constantly aware of how our own privilege, especially white privilege, interacts with his arguments and power. So he talks a lot in this chapter about people who went to France, which is also called the metropole, the center of the colony, and how these French Antilleans behaved differently when they came home to the islands of Guadeloupe and Martinique. They acted and they spoke like white men. They behaved differently, like bowing rather than hugging their friends. And he connects the fact that Black people spoke and acted differently with white people and French colonizers. So not only are they treating their friends and family different when they return home, they're also speaking differently with the French and white people, and then vice versa. If they have never been to the metropole or to France, they're speaking differently than the white men. and the colonizers, and they are behaving differently with them. Why is this? He says that semiotics, or like the study of language, can help us to understand this phenomena. So he says that language is power and that every single person has a culture and a worldview. And part of how we get a culture and a worldview is that we are taught language. Our language shapes our culture and worldview in very both abstract and concrete ways. I think about the process of learning a new language, and you have to kind of have these different thoughts in your head about, is the prepositional phrase, do you sit on something? Do you sit above something? There's like almost like a little mental shift that goes into place. So that's one example of how learning a new language can start to shape your worldview and introduce you to a new culture, is that you have to start thinking about objects and the world differently. He says that in his time period, the 1950s, a huge part of the reason why language is creating such a power differential is the theory of social evolutionism. And this was the theory that humans evolved from apes to humans, and that Black people were an in-between link with white people at the very top of a hierarchy. Now, this theory is false and has been completely disproven, but in the 1950s, a lot of people believed this, including scientists and medical officials. So responding to that, of course, a lot of white people and Black people believed that Black people were not only like culturally inferior, but also like biologically and intellectually inferior, which is false. But they acted on that belief and that worldview. So what they would do to try to deal with this inferiority complex that they adopted, Black Antillians would assume and assimilate with the French language. He says the more the Black Antillian assimilates the French language, the whiter he gets, i.e., the closer he comes to becoming a true human being. So he's reflecting here that also Black people were not viewed as fully human. They were viewed as sort of like being in a childlike state to white people. So he adopts this analogy, which eventually becomes the title of this book. He says that the Black Antilles people are essentially like a Black person with Black skin, and they adopt a white mask through language, through behaviors, through cultural mannerisms, as a way to uplift themselves and make themselves feel not only superior to other Black people, but also like, it's almost like this aggrandizing, like, I'm not a nobody, I'm not a subhuman person, like I speak French excellently, I am educated, I have been to France and seen civilization, that sort of idea. And Fanon also talks about how the Black people, and by extension all colonized peoples, use language in a way that reinforced this inferiority complex. And the white people and colonizers did the opposite. They used language in a way that reinforced superiority complexes. So how did they do this? In language, the Black people positioned themselves lower in relation to the, quote, civilizing language and the, quote, metropolitan culture. They believed that being more colonized equals more qualities and values of the metropolis, that rejecting Blackness and, quote unquote, the bush or local customs, the whiter they could become. However, there were, of course, limits on how high their status could be given their Black skin. So starting to dive into the examples where I think this becomes a little bit more concrete, he says that in the French Antilles, for example, the white bourgeoisie only used Creole, the language of the French Antilles, when speaking to servants. Youth were forbidden from speaking Creole at home and were chided by parents for doing it because they believed it was sort of like backwaters or primitive or savage. In another example, he says in France, they say, quote, to speak like a book by speaking French well. In Martinique, they say, quote, to speak like a white man. So in their eyes, the white man is sort of this put on a pedestal as like the epitome of culture and privilege, and they aspire to speak French like a white man and therefore get closer to power and privilege themselves. So other examples of how this inferiority complex was presenting itself in the use of language. The Black Antillians were heavily set on glorifying France. He talks a lot about how the French Antillians would visit France and then return back changed. He says, quote, if you meet him on his return from Paris, and especially if you've never been to the capital, he'll never stop singing its praises. Paris, the city of light, the Seine, the riverside dance cafes, etc., etc. He also acknowledges that being from an island without many economic prospects and jobs, they can also really see Europe as liberating and like inspiring. And I really connected with this point as a rural white American. You know, you hear about people back in the day where they would go on vacation to somewhere in Europe and you're like, oh, they went to France, they saw the Eiffel Tower, oh, so romantic, so beautiful, you're so cultured and rich. This is exactly the same thing. It's glorifying the metropole, the center of the colonizing nation. Second, he says that they had a fear of being seen as other. So there's a stereotype at the time that people from Martinique couldn't pronounce their French R's correctly. He says, quote, yes, I must watch my diction because that's how they'll judge me. He can't even speak French properly, they'll say with the utmost contempt. So if you're seen as, and in any way queer, uneducated, inferior through whatever social hierarchy that they are deeming as most important or most salient at the time, other people are using that to put other people down, and it creates this fear in the person of being perceived as inferior, of being perceived as the colonized other. He tells a story that's kind of funny. He says there's a Martinician in Paris who's getting drunk, and he says, waiter, bring me a drink of beer, end quote. He says that the man is, quote, anxious not to correspond to the black man who swallows his R's, and therefore he makes use of a great many of them, but doesn't know how to divide them out. So he's like, he knows that R's are very important, but he's too drunk to like distinguish which R's and how to distinguish them. So it shows almost like this unconscious fear of, even while you're sort of out of it, being drunk, of being perceived as this colonized other who can't even speak French properly. And this is tied to this belief that proximity to the colony or the colonizer and whiteness, therefore, and power is a way to elevate oneself in this artificial social hierarchy. So for example, these people who would visit France would return and only answer their family members and friends in French. And they would say they no longer understand Creole. There's a very funny folktale that he shares where a young farmer returns from France and says, quote, on seeing a plow, he asks his father, an old, don't pull that kind of thing on me, peasant. He says, what's that thing called? By way of an answer, his father drops the plow on his foot and his amnesia vanishes, end quote. So it shows, this story shows how the young farmer is like aligning himself with Frenchness as a way to sort of say, I'm better than you, or like, I'm more cultured, more distinguished than you, my old peasant father. And his father, of course, takes him down a notch by being like, you remember your Creole, you remember where you came from. He says that the people who return from France become critical of their fellow islanders at home and believe that he knows better than them and proves himself through his use of language. once again, I felt a very strong connection to this through being raised in a rural and rather poor area. In that, you know, my aunt lived in Minneapolis and would come all the way down to our little small town. It was like, oh, she's from Minneapolis, you know, the big city, and there's skyscrapers there, and the Mall of America. It's this really aggrandizing view. And then eventually, when I came to Minneapolis as a young college student, I sort of returned home, and I was like, oh, look at this backwater town, you know, and nobody gets it back here. They're so uneducated, and they're so they I know better than them. And it so you can see how reflecting on Fanon's teaching in this way gives you an opportunity to challenge your own internalized colonial narratives and rhetoric and discourses. So carrying on, he says that when these people, the youth who return from France, the people engage in this sort of like social testing, is what I'm going to call it. They're sort of like gauging, like, has it actually changed you, or are you still the same little country bumpkin, just like the rest of us? So a bunch of kids come and question this returnee. In this quote, they say, "The slightest mistake is seized upon, scrutinized, and in less than 48 hours, it will be all over Fort-de-France. There is no forgiving the Martinician flaunting his superiority for failing his duty. So if you answer incorrectly, if you mess up your French, if you fail in some way to adhere to this social norm, this hierarchy that you're trying to emulate, you'll be ridiculed and taken down a notch by the other people in your society." And then he says, quote, "For people will never forget. Once married, his wife will realize she has married a joke, and his children will have to deal with and live down the tale," end quote. So there, it's in a way, the other Martinicians and Guadeloupe residents are reinforcing that social hierarchy by almost like demanding that the returnees perform appropriately to this social hierarchy, that they have to be changed by the experience from their proximity to civilization, whiteness, and power. And if you do not perform that appropriately, you're seen as like a failure in the society, and you're taken down that notch in the social hierarchy again. He talks as well about trying to overcome your inferiority complex by adopting a colonizer identity. One prime example is, quote, "the educated Black man who is constantly trying to overcome it." I think a lot of like the turn of the century, the negritude movement, the new Negro movement, where a lot of Black scholars and Black academics were trying to like really assert themselves as like intellectuals by adopting all of like the fashion, the dress, the rhetoric, and like the literature of a lot of like white philosophers, white intellectuals, as a way to be like, we are equal to you, we are on the same level as you. And Fanon would argue that this is like a really misguided attempt, rather than being an intellectual on your own terms and defining like a new Black intellectual identity. You're still reinforcing the hierarchy by saying through your actions and through your words that white intellectualism and white culture is superior. Next, he talks about how the people developed and maintained a hierarchy amongst the oppressed. And in a lot of circles, I've heard this discussed as the oppression Olympics, of like, who's more oppressed than each other, and like sort of arguing over who we are focusing on as like the most oppressed identity. He gives an example that the Antilleans in France, who were also there with a couple of African visitees, were upset to be mistaken for Senegalese because, quote, Antillean is more évolué or evolved than the African, meaning that he is closer to the white man. And this difference exists not only on the street or among the boulevard, but also in the administration and the army. So they believed that, you know, the worst thing you can be in this social hierarchy of the colony of France is an African who is Black. And so amongst Black people who are colonized by the French, they have also adopted this social hierarchy that they believed, oh, the Antilleans, they're a little bit more evolved, a little bit more educated than the Africans, who are very like poor and oppressed and uneducated. And so therefore they're better than them. And then that was reflected in the way that they organized their government and their army. So the vice versa example, he says that people from Dahomey or the Congo in Africa would sometimes tell people that they are from the Antilles in a way to sort of like grab even that little tiny bit more power in their social interactions. He shares a story of people fighting with the army, the colonial army, and the Senegalese unit was ordered out and then forced back by the troops 3 times. And then finally, one of the Senegalese asked why the Tubabs, which is a word, an African word that means whites and foreigners, didn't go. And in such moments, we no longer knew whether we were Tubabs or natives, we being the French Antilleans. That would be the last straw to put us with the N-words. The European despises the African, and the Antillean lords it as uncontested master over this Black rabble. End quote. So in this very like challenging moment of like, we're literally fighting a war, they have this like standoff of like, when you're saying like the foreigners or the whites, and who are you actually talking about amongst the troops? The French Antilleans were like not wanting to be grouped with the Black Senegalese. And in that way, you can see how this sort of oppression Olympics plays out of like, oh, who's really the blackest of them all? It's extremely misguided, to say the least. It engages in a lot of like infighting, and it's a divide and conquer strategy. So that the French can have the other Black colonized peoples fighting each other rather than grouping together and fighting the French, punching up. So then, given all of these examples, Fanon wants to especially dive into, but like, why are the Antilleans so obsessed with wanting to speak good French? First of all, he says it's a choice to speak and write in French. Jean-Paul Sartre says that Black poets will eventually turn against the French language in sort of like this political ploy to like reassert their own power, because it seems like they at the time were recognizing these power hierarchies and differentials. But he argues that Antilleans won't, probably due to those oppression Olympics, as we just discussed. Fanon agrees and adds that Michael Leary, who wrote that the language of Creole, will eventually be a relic of the past because of the anti-Creole attitudes that, you know, French Antillean mothers, the school system, and the colonizers had. They were essentially like the Native American languages in the domestic United States. They were forced to like not speak it. They didn't pass it down to their children. They thought it was like primitive, backwater, savage, until this language reclamation movement, which thankfully did arise after the writing of this book in the 1950s. At the time, Fanon says that this is an opportunity for struggle where they could actually regain some sort of power and this sense of lost identity. He says that translating works from indigenous language into French were showing really great promise as a way of like articulating and asserting the importance and intellectual value of the Creole language. So thankfully, a lot of like the more modern language reclamation projects have kept the language alive into the present day. And once again, that choice is a tactic to reclaim even the tiniest bit of power and privilege in this artificial social hierarchy. He then talks about the difference between dialects and French. For example, in Brittany, they have a dialect, but the Bretons don't consider themselves inferior to the French because they were never colonized and they are largely white. So that is versus Creole, which is a French-based language. It has a lot of French words that exist in part of it, but it's not really a dialect, and it is considered a very different language, partially because of the relationship of colonization and the power differential that exists between the people who speak Creole and the French. And then finally, he says, color prejudice and what we would now call racism is the ultimate cause and must be ended. So there's a big section in the book here where he's talking about, quote unquote, the Black question of Black inferiority, and is sort of making this really tired argument where he's like, they're not inferior. This is ridiculous. We, in a more modern audience, would take this to be as a truth. But it is fascinating to hear his argument at the time and how he goes about this, because I think it really shows almost like this very like poetic, literary side of Fanon. So, for example, he says there was an Antillean with a philosophy degree that he was talking to, who said that he wouldn't sit for agrégation, which is a really important exam in France, because of the color of his skin. And Fanon says, quote, philosophy never saved anybody. Then he says, another Black person said that Black intelligence is equal as white man. And Fanon says, quote, neither did intelligence save anybody. For if equality among men is proclaimed in the name of intelligence and philosophy, these concepts have been used to justify the extermination of man, end quote. So he is saying, in different words, that philosophy and intelligence aren't going to save you. This racism and prejudice are not about philosophy. They're not about the intelligence of Black men. They're about hatred. They're about real visceral prejudices, about misinformation and falsehood. So you can argue Black intelligence all you want, is kind of what he's saying. But intelligence and philosophy are also tools that are being used to justify the extermination of Black men. So why would those specifically be tools for arguing for equality and anti-racism as themselves, as distinct concepts themselves? When he talks about this, he says he is speaking of both, quote, alienated or mystified Blacks, and on the other of no less alienated, quote, mystifying and mystified whites. This is sort of getting into some decolonial theory and critical race theory of like this idea of like the mystified Black, the Black man of the jungle, that sort of construct, and then both the mystified, white fantastical history of like white history that did not really exist in this sort of romanticized sense, as well as the mystifying, where they are the ones creating and enacting these rhetorics and myths about other people, other races. So he says, Sartre and Cardinal Verdier, these other writers that he's talking about, says the Black question has gone on too long. And he gives this really great quote: anyone who tries to read in my eyes anything but a perpetual questioning won't see a thing, neither gratitude nor hatred. And if I utter a great shout, it won't be black. No, there is no black problem. Or at least if there is one, the whites are only accidentally interested. Our history takes place in obscurity, and the sun I carry with me must lighten every corner, end quote. And I thought that was really beautiful. It's about, you know, almost like sharing the truth. Like, I think a lot about like the Trump, like post-truth era. It's like, but we have this really complicated construct of racism, of classism, of xenophobia. All of the isms rely on this obscurity and almost like this mystifying commitment to myth and not reality, not fact, not truth. And I love this metaphor he shares, that like the light of the sun within him will lighten every corner and share this truth with the world. Ending this section here, he discusses the scientific evidence about brain equality and inequality and the use of the Bible to justify racism. And then finally says that appealing to humanity, dignity, love, and charity would be easy to prove equality. But what Fanon wants is to ultimately liberate people from colonial constructs and complexes. Like, talking about love, dignity, charity isn't quite enough. We need to like actually dig out these like discourses and stereotypes, myths, and rhetorics, and like undo them in our behaviors, in our thoughts, in our actions. And that is what is actually going to have the consequence of liberating all peoples from racist constructs and colonialism by extension. How do we do this? Well, first of all, he says it's essentially like standing up for yourself. He has a lot of examples in regards to the speaking of pidgin and being spoken to in pidgin. So Oxford Dictionary defines pidgin as a grammatically simplified form of a language used for communication between people not sharing a common language. So an example he shares is that a Catholic priest asked a Black churchgoer, quote, why you left Big Savannah and why you come with us, end quote. And when the man responded politely, he embarrassed the priest and everybody laughed, and it ended in a good-natured moment. White people at the time believed that Black people were like children and were mentally incompetent, and so many chose to speak pidgin. Fanon says, quote, that speaking to Black people in this way is an attempt to reach down to them, to make them feel at ease, to make oneself understood and reassured. He gives an example of like a well-meaning white doctor who spoke in pidgin to Black patients, quote, you not good, quote, and then, end quote. And then of course, all of his other white patients, he's speaking to them totally normally in French. Fanon says, quote, will be told there is no intention to willfully give offense. Okay, but it is precisely this absence of will, this offhand manner, this casualness, and the ease with which they classify him, imprison him at an uncivilized and primitive level that is insulting. So the use of pidgin and the assuming that the Black man cannot speak proper French is thoughtless and harmful in and of itself, whether or not that doctor intended for harm or offense to take place. Fanon draws connection to working with severe dementia patients in his psychology practice. And he says that it is very similar. It's like they're talking to Black people as if they're mentally incapable. And then he further says, don't engage in paternalism, even with others like Arabs. So like Black people don't even use that with Arabs, for example. Drawing once again on those oppression Olympics, do not create these false hierarchies within other oppressed peoples. Answering back in pidgin to the white person who is speaking in pidgin to you ultimately makes it worse for everybody, because that person will go, see, I was right. They do speak Pidgin. And so using this example of speaking Pidgin and being spoken to in Pidgin, he says the answer is what we would say, obviously. But back in those days, sadly, was not obvious. You need to stand up for yourself. So if you stand up for yourself and you behave like a man, you object to being treated too familiarly, spoken into in Pidgin, you crumble the foundations of inequality being asserted. Quote, to speak Pidgin means you stay where you are, end quote. So it's, while this is not an example that we see in, I would say modern day as much in America or even in France, I could probably assert that. The mechanism of trying to put people in their place through how you speak to them is still alive and well. So it is a paternalistic attitude towards people. It is assuming the educational status of somebody based on their appearance. It is treating people differently based on their appearance or perceived differences. And the purpose being, whether intentionally or unintentionally, to keep those people in a lower position in this artificial social hierarchy. So of course, the proper response is to stand up for oneself. But the power of the colonial regime at the time was essentially like so powerful, so dangerous to like assert your humanity as a Black person, that this was like revolutionary. This was like really difficult. It could threaten your life if you weren't careful. And I think that there's a lot of parallels to the modern day where speaking up to power, sort of punching up in a way, is still just as dangerous in very different ways, but it is still valuable as an exercise when it is physically possible to stay safe. It needs to be said that we need to stand up for ourselves in these sorts of circumstances. That was a very long aside, but getting back into his flow of his argument. So from discussing the example of speaking Pidgin, he talks about stereotypes in the media. And of course, a lot of people in the media at the time were speaking in Pidgin as Black people. He discusses that a lot of Black people in TV and movies were portrayed as being subservient and agreeable. They presented Black people as these like subservient helpers or comedians, and tied them to a lot of stereotypes. And then in real life, if Black people defied stereotypes, they were viewed as, quote, suspect. So for example, quote, just as the Jew who is lavish with his money is suspect, so the Black man who quotes Montesquieu must be watched insofar as he might start something. And he says further that this is not to say that like a Black student who's quoting Montesquieu is suspect to his professors. That's an appropriate use of, you know, knowledge and concept in a classroom, let's say. But he's saying, quote, outside university circles, there is an army of fools. It is a question not of educating them, but of teaching the Black man not to be a slave of their archetypes. So reclaiming your sense of power is not about teaching the, you know, white people who view the Black people as inferior, but of teaching the Black people in this example to stand up for themselves, to be authentic and sincere, to defy stereotypes in the media, and therefore by being authentic and sincere, be an example that counters stereotypes, and therefore is like a more effective method of teaching to those very white people. I hope that's clear. And finally, he talks about ultimately all of this is also very tied with racialized capitalism, that all of this inequality is a result of culture, psychology, and economics all playing together. And he says that being Black, speaking of Marx, a lot of like university elites will say, quote, "We educated you and now you're turning against your benefactors." And then the classic argument, he says, quote, "argument from the plantation owners in Africa. Our enemy is the elementary school teacher," end quote. And it totally makes me think of like Trumpian Republicans and stuff today. Because of course they're going after elementary school teachers too. You learn these rhetorics, this how to be a colonized subject and what it means to have a colonizer in our youth, in things like our elementary school education. We learned about the basic rules of the world, about economics, capitalism, objects being commodities. We learn those as youth. And it is ingrained in us through life experience from youth. So of course, if you are a colonizer who is trying to exert power over and dominance over your colonized peoples, your enemy is the elementary school teacher who tries to truly educate your youth, who tries to challenge stereotypes, who really questions these concepts like culture, psychology, economics, capitalism, and race. So in a way, you like have to go against them if you want to maintain that power and dominance over the next generation. And so, of course, through saying this, he's recognizing that our opportunity for liberation in the next generation is at the site of the elementary school teacher, is at the youth in challenging and questioning these concepts that we eventually take for granted when they are so ingrained from such young ages. One of the ways that we can do that is by defying those stereotypes, by speaking well, by writing well, by doing your job well. In his example, it puts Black people on more equal footing, and therefore, quote, "the game is no longer possible. He's a pure replica of the white man who has to surrender to the facts," end quote. So there were a lot of these examples he was giving of, Black academics or Black speakers or Black people on work sites who were just comporting themselves normally, doing good jobs, and staying in their lane. And these white people were like losing it. They were like, how is this possible? What is he doing? Oh my God, freaking out about it. And here he's just succeeding, and like doing a good job. And it's because, the power of defying stereotypes is it starts to call into question the whole game, the whole colonial narrative of hierarchy, of being other people being inferior or superior to one another, when in fact they are all equal. All human beings are equal regardless of identity characteristics, and it is the artificial hierarchy that is imposed upon them by the colonizers and taken on within the very psyches of these colonized peoples and reproduced over generations that creates these hierarchies and maintains them. So yeah, he says that people have a choice to support the white world and this hierarchy or to reject it. He gives an example of Antillean students in Paris. When they, after school's done or after their daily work is done, they go and meet in a cafe. They can decide either to discuss these like proper issues in French with the appropriate European affect, or they can comfortably gather and say yo and speak Creole to each other. That is a choice. It is an intentional choice, and that is powerful. Every single person in that scenario has a choice, whether they support these power structures or they defy it. He says, quote, "A Senegalese who learns Creole to pass for an Antillean is a case of alienation. The Antillians who make a mockery out of him are lacking in judgment," end quote. So once again, it is a choice. Do not mock your brother. Be with them in solidarity. There is no hierarchy between oppressed peoples. We are all oppressed, and some are hurting more than others, but we can recognize that, and we can say, we can live in solidarity with each other. Don't put each other down. He says, speaking French does open doors and provide opportunity in a racist world. He wants to like really emphasize that. That's very understandable, and it's going to help you get schooling, education, influence, that sort of thing. However, Fanon argues that the person who goes out of their way to adapt the subtleties of the language and like has this sense that they need to like prove themselves as like, quote, culturally adequate or better than their peers is the problem. So really calling into question those people who are like trying so hard to gain even that tiny little bit of power. Reject it. Don't do it. He gives an example of a speaker, Breton, who was talking about Aimé Césaire. He says, quote, "Here is a black man who handles the French language unlike any white man today," end quote. On the one hand, he is praising Césaire of how well he speaks, but of course, he says his praise reveals that he thinks black men are lesser or cannot speak French well. And then he sort of like cynically quotes, "But blacks will retort, we should be honored that a white man such as Breton writes such things about us." So we also need to reject the impulse to maintain hierarchies, to try and like almost like see the compliment through the racism. And it's like, no, he's being racist, you know, or using, so to draw it into other contexts and a more modern example, you know, a lot of people will say like a woman poet, woman author, black poet, black author. The distinguishment is meant to create praise, to elevate the author or poet amongst their peers, but ultimately the separation or the distinction in opposition to specifically white poets and authors is perpetuating the hierarchy. So standing up for yourself in that case is being like, no, I'm a poet, I'm a writer, and everyone is my peer, including white authors, including black authors, that sort of thing. So finally, I'd like to share from all of these bullet points, what are the relevant lessons for today? Number one, you are colonized regardless of race. You have been trained to think and operate in colonial complexes from a very young age as part of your schooling, through the US, imperial war machine, through our educational schooling system, racialized capitalism, mass incarceration, the news media. It is steeped in this colonial complex of inferiority, superiority, and trying to divide and conquer the colonized people or the masses. Do not glorify the colonizer and the metropole. So it's, well, isn't it nice that cities may have better education or a more distinct artistic culture than a rural place? Sure, but the rural place is not worse. In fact, the rural place deserves just as much education, development, and artistic credence as the metropole. And try to break down those binaries within your mind and how you think about your country and your world. Defy the fear of being seen as the other. Essentially, let your freak flag fly when it is safe, physically safe, create safety for yourself, of course, but also really challenge that internal fear of being sort of othered out, third wheeled, becoming an outsider, essentially, for some sort of identity characteristic, for some sort of physical appearance that you have, anything that you can think of. Really deal with that fear. Do not believe that proximity to power elevates the person, because we are all equal humans. Just because someone is your boss or your supervisor, they are not better than you. They are not better than you. Speak to them as an equal and demand that they speak to you as an equal. Do not play that power game of the hierarchies, especially because so much power and privilege tends to fall amongst racialized lines and across other isms like ability, gender, and other false hierarchies that the colonizer tries to create within the masses to divide and conquer them. Don't engage in social testing and mind games with other people. Be authentic and sincere. So try not to engage in like infighting, sort of nitpicking, and I guess just being weird with like coworkers and stuff. I mean, I think we've all seen it in our workplaces and out in society where people are like, why are you wearing that? Or like, who do you think you are saying that? Or like asking them to like prove themselves. Like, oh, did you really graduate from Yale? You know, don't play the games. Don't play the games. Just be yourself and ask that other people do the same. And really assert that sense of like self-power and self-respect when you do so, and be like, nope, I don't engage with that. This is not helpful to like our collective, you know, solidarity. This is not helping our workplace. This is not growing togetherness. This is creating division. And I want to create togetherness, that sort of thing. Defy your inferiority complex. Don't adopt the culture and symbols of the colonizer to elevate yourself. So, what does this mean for a lot of white people who might be watching? Well, of course, a lot of white people want to be rich. And that is sort of like the big hierarchical leap in to white people. So things that I think of is like celebrity worship. You know, don't be like, oh, they tracking and following every celebrity move. You got to get the latest Kylie Jenner lip kit, whatever. Adopting those culture, those symbols, the latest iPhone, the newest TV, the prettiest pictures on Instagram where you're adopting similar poses and face-tuned filters as a celebrity that you follow. Don't adopt the culture and symbols of the colonizer to elevate yourself. Be yourself. Know yourself. And know that you are valid, worthy, and equal, regardless of these artificial social hierarchies that exist within your society, whether they be race, ability, gender, class, or any other ism. Don't play the oppression Olympics. All are oppressed under colonization. We can help those who are most hurting and recognize that all are hurting. This is not a one or the other scenario. Like, we are all hurting, and we can also triage, care, and support. We can confront and deal with racism, color prejudice, colorism, and all other isms that persist. Unconscious bias is real and can be dealt with. There are countless resources out there. I really, really strongly encourage you to look them up and to really challenge them. I mean, the most famous example I would say is like Ibram X. Kendi's like anti-racism texts. How we can go from there's just this sort of passive, like, I'm not a racist, to like actively being anti-racist and like doing things, saying things, and making direct changes in our lives and communities to combat racism. See that example? It's a very different way of thinking about bias and racism, taking it from a passive state to an active state. Do not speak like an inferior, and don't allow others to speak to you as an inferior. Sort of tied in with the one, do not believe that proximity to power elevates the person. We are all equal here, and we're not going to be spoken to like that, and we're not going to speak to others like that anymore. Challenge media representation and stereotypes and defy them in your own life. And that's going to look different for everybody depending on what identity characteristics you have individually. And I think there's a lot of resources and specifically YouTube videos out there that challenge media representation and stereotypes. Recognize racialized capitalism is the cause and does threaten us all. I feel like this is going to keep coming up in Black Skin, White Masks. We're going to keep dealing with this all throughout, our daily lives and our media landscape. Racialized capitalism is the cause and threatens us all. Deal with that however you see fit, but you must deal with it. And I think there's a lot of resources out there. Personally, I am currently reading a lot about anarchism and alternative economic systems. But of course, it's a very slow process, so I don't have a lot to share on my YouTube right now. But more is coming on that. I challenge you to really find your own project like that. Choose to reject hierarchies and colonial rule, even in familiar interactions. So today's prime example, that Israel resumed bombing of Gaza and over 400 people were killed overnight. Do not be shy about telling your family about this, talking to your friends, talking to your coworkers and saying, this is outrageous that the United States armed and abetted this genocide and continues to aid and abet this genocide. And I'm not going to stand for it. I'm going to keep talking about it, and I'm going to get out in the streets and protest about it this week and next week. I have plans to do so. So choose to reject hierarchies and colonial rule in your own life. How are you going to do that? What actions can you take at your job, in talking to your friends, in scrolling on social media? What can you personally do? If you have absolutely no idea, Google it. So many resources do exist. I have a collection of questions here for self-reflection as we close out this video. Choose a couple. So I have 2 pages here, but you're going to know specifically what really needs to be dealt with on your own personal level. So I'll just read these off. Feel free to screenshot and pause the video to read specific ones. But I really would like you to do some journaling, do some reflection. Shower thoughts are the best thoughts. Go on a walk. Really think about this. So I'm going to read these and then I'm going to close off the video. But thank you so much for watching. If you don't stick around for the whole reading of these questions, and I hope you learned something here. I'm going to keep trying to put out these videos. I have a lot more planned, and I'm trying my best to speed things up as everything in America kind of speeds up with sort of this descent into fascism that we're currently experiencing. So I appreciate you. I love you. Thank you so much for being here, and keep fighting the good fight. All right. So self-reflection. 1. Where and how do you elevate the colonizer in your mind and speech? For example, celebrity fandom. 2. Being seen as an other in society can be scary due to potential threats. How can you be more authentically yourself and defy fear of being seen as the other while maintaining physical safety? 3. How and when are you subservient to other people? Who is your master in your life? How could you level the playing field between yourself and that person or entity? 4. Do you engage in social testing or playing mind games with other people? What drives the desire to do that? How could you deal with the root cause of that drive? 5. What culture and symbols of power do you appropriate to feel better about yourself? What do you long to be seen as, or who do you long to be seen as, and why? For example, rich, or at least not struggling, educated, an Ivy League. 6, I think. How can you change the narrative when you witness others playing the oppression Olympics? Where can you intervene to help those who are hurting the most? How do you protect and maintain your own well-being as you do so? 7. Confront and deal with racism, color prejudice, colorism, and all other isms that persist. What are your unconscious biases and how can you challenge them in your life? How can you be actively anti-racist in your day-to-day interactions? How and where can you stand up for yourself as an equal in your job or in your day-to-day life? If you witness someone putting others down, how could you change the narrative and support human equality? What media stereotypes and representations do you support or defy in your life? Recognize that racialized capitalism is the cause and threatens us all. What is your relationship to race and capitalism? How do you think we can dismantle racialized capitalism politically? How would dismantling racialized capitalism change your interpersonal interactions? What countries and people are overtly colonized today? Are you one of them? How can you address that with your friends, family, and colleagues? Could you ask one of them to learn more about decolonization? How could you join in the effort to liberate colonized peoples? Once again, thanks so much for watching, and I hope you have a great rest of your day.